I shall begin. Is everybody sitting comfortably? I will begin. All right, it's a very short presentation, this. I hope you can all hear me from the title, The Sinking of the Tirpitz. So let's just do a few things. What was it? Well, it was a German battleship, and it was launched in Wilhelmshaven on the 1st of April, 1939. Not a very rather auspicious day, isn't it, to be launching a battleship. But it wasn't commissioned until much later. So, all right, it was launched, but so why am I interested? That's the main thing. Well, I suppose I've got an interest in a lot of things, historical, maybe contemporary history, but a number of reasons. Number one is I've actually visited the Tirpitz Museum at a place called Alta in Norway, which I'll talk about later. And later, I discovered some of the maps made for bombers were made at Hughenden Manor in Buckinghamshire, where I visited somewhat later than visiting Alta. Although I had been to Hughenden Manor in 1960 when I was still at school. I'll explain why Hughenden Manor has some importance in British political history. Well, what about the Tirpitz? What was it? Well, it was a Bismarck-class battleship. So pretty enormous, nearly 52,000 tons displacement. And it was darn big thing, over 800 feet long and nearly 120 feet wide. And look at that for speed, 35 miles an hour. And it reckoned it could do 10,000 mile range. So a battleship, Second World War, big range, big threat. Get an idea, the crew, 103 officers, nearly 2,000 enlisted men. Now here's a picture of it in Alta Fjord. So formidable. And here's another picture of it at its mooring. And it says here, the Tirpitz at its first mooring in Kar Fjord. This picture was taken in July 1943. Oh, and you've got a translation anyway. So there it is at rest. What about armaments? Well, here we go, 8 15-inch guns. Imagine that, 15 inches, it's enormous, isn't it, for a gun? 4 turrets, 12 6-inch guns, 16 4-inch, and some smaller 1.5-inch guns or whatever the metric equivalent was, and 12 slightly smaller guns, and 8 torpedo tubes. So a battleship in every sense of the word, isn't it? Well, and it was armor plated as well. Imagine that, going 35 miles an hour with the armor plate in the belt. There was a belt around it 13 inches wide, the turrets 14 inches wide. I'm not sure of the thickness, and the main deck up to nearly 5 inches in width. On top, it also had 4 float planes. So what about it in service? Let's go through that. Well, it was the center of the Baltic fleet. Remember, the Germans had a big port at a place called Königsberg, which they no longer own. It's now part of Russia, called Kaliningrad. And if you've ever worked Kaliningrad on the radio, it's usually United Alpha 2. It's a bit of an enclave now because Lithuania got independence, and so did Poland. But that was part of what was East Prussia, and now that enclave is part of Russia and the rest of East Prussia is part of Poland. Well, it didn't go out into the open ocean because the German fleet had suffered really two enormous setbacks. One in 1939, the Battle of the River Plate, when the Graf Spee was cornered and went into Montevideo Harbour in Uruguay, and I've actually seen some of the remains of it by the harbour, and it was scuttled. And then 1941, the Bismarck, a similar battleship, was sunk in the Atlantic. So, and we've got to remember, the Royal Navy was a formidable force. It was probably the biggest navy in the world at the time. And the old Pax Britannica. And so the Germans feared the Royal Navy. And remember, the Royal Navy had blockaded Germany in the First World War, bringing them to their knees. On top of that, there was the Saint-Nazaire raid in France, where I've forgotten the name of the ship now, that was Invercargill, was packed with explosive and rammed the dry dock gates and went off. In fact, there used to be an old chap that went in the Big and Hawk pub on a Monday night called Jim. I've forgotten his surname, that was actually on the raid and got captured. So the Germans had a lot of fear that if it went out into the open, it would be sunk. I mean, that must have cost a phenomenal amount of money to have built. But it became a deterrent against the invasion of Norway. Remember, the Germans believed that Norway was going to be somewhere the Allies would invade. And so they wanted a deterrent. And also, it prevented the Soviet breakout. Remember, St. Petersburg's only just up the road from Königsberg, or Kaliningrad as it is today. So the Soviet Navy, although not as big as the Royal Navy, was still something to be feared. But it remained a threat for us to Arctic convoys. Remember, we were trying to supply Russia up in the Arctic. Well, its only offensive action was pretty minor. September 1943, it accompanied a battle cruiser called the Scharnhorst, and it bombarded Allied positions on Spitsbergen. That's well, called Svalbard now, I think. It was a Norwegian, which is part of Norway, but in those days, as Norway was occupied by the Germans, Spitsbergen was occupied by the Allies. And it's Juliet Whiskey, if you've ever worked anyone on there. It's a big coal mine on there. I don't know whether it's still used. I don't think it is. I did sail up there once, but we couldn't get in. That was in July because the harbour was blocked with ice coming from Greenland. But it did cause a disaster for us. Convoy PQ17, again, one of these convoys meant to go to Soviet Russia. And then reports of the presence of the Tirpitz caused the convoy to disperse. And sadly, 21 out of the 34 ships in the convoy were sunk, probably by U-boats and bombers. So it was a threat, and therefore had to be sunk. So I mentioned it was in a place called Alta or Karfjord. Where's that? Well, here's, you can see Alta here, and here's the Arctic Circle. So we're north of the Arctic Circle. There's Narvik and Tromsø, fairly big ports. So here's where it was located. More detailed map shows you Alta Fjord, and Carfiord down here, where it was moored. I went up there in 2015 on a cruise. The main purpose of going was to see the total eclipse of the sun off the Faroe Islands, but we did go to Alta, and that was in March. Didn't get much suntan, but never mind. Well, there were lots of attacks on the ship. It says numerous attacks. There was the first real big attempt was February 1941 by the RAF. It was unsuccessful. In almost a year later, there was an attack by RAF Stirlings and Halifaxes, again unsuccessful. There was a further attack by Halifax and Lancaster bombers, but the bombing accuracy wasn't very good and they missed the target. And then there were attacks by mini submarines. And anyone's ever seen the film Above Us, the Waves? John Mills. Oh, this is a so-called reenactment. And they did damage it. In fact, they did blow it out of the water. So it caused damage. 15th of September, it was struck by 2 tallboy bombs, and they moved it to Tromsø, a bit nearer the coast, which was a tactical mistake because the raid where the tallboy bombs were dropped were from Russia. There were attacks by Lancasters from Russia. They flew over neutral Sweden. But they moved it to within range of Lancasters based at now what is RAF Lossiemouth. And this was fateful. So on the 12th of November 1944, it was attacked by Lancasters. 2 tallboys had direct hits and several near misses. The ship capsized and over 1,000 crew were lost. So had a very short life, didn't it? Launched in 1st of April 1939, sunk the 12th of November 1944. Some of you may know about tallboy bombs, but if you don't, well, another of Barnes Wallis's inventions. Look at that, 12,000 pounds in weight. Now you're starting to think, how the devil do you get this into a bomber? These were 21 feet long and 10 feet of it was the tail. And they're aerodynamically stable. That was Barnes Wallis's great invention. I didn't realize this and I looked it up, but they were made by Vickers and they made 854 of them. Not all were dropped on the Tirpitz. They were dropped on other targets. And they were made from one piece of high tensile steel to survive the impact. It was the important thing. Now, they were dropped from 18,000 feet. So start doing a bit of the old basic physics. Started out at 170 miles an hour and they hit their target at 750 miles an hour. So they'd gone supersonic. Must have been frightening to be around them. If they were dropped on land, they made a crater about 80 feet deep and 100 feet wide. And I've actually seen a crater caused by a tallboy bomb at a place called Lacapoule. Lacapoule, I think is the French pronunciation, in Normandy. It was a cupola where they were going to fire V2 rockets into the UK. But the tallboy bombs knocked the cupola out of alignment, and that was the end of that. So you're starting to think of some formidable weapon. 1944, remember. And they were capable of penetrating the armour plating on the Tirpitz. And something else I'd forgotten about until I did this, they had tail pistols fitted to detonate the bombs once they'd penetrated the target. So you get hit by one, and then a few minutes later, the explosive goes off. Well, what did they use? Well, Lancasters, but not just ordinary Lancasters, they were modified. Now think about this. Armor plating and armaments were removed. Bomb door was modified. In short, the crew that flew them were extremely brave and had very little defensive weaponry against any fighters, which fortunately didn't take off in time. And here's a picture of one I found, where you can see from the RAF technician there the size of them. Absolutely monstrous, weren't they? And here's the only picture I could find of a Lancaster with one strapped underneath. And here's some pictures taken on the raid of a Lancaster flying over Carfjord. And here's a picture that was probably taken by the Norwegian resistance. They couldn't really hide this. The Norwegian resistance was very efficient and they knew what was going on. And here's a bit of a map I found at the museum. So 32 Lancasters, they dropped 29 of them. And here's a reconnaissance map. So you can see, it doesn't really matter if you don't hit it. By the time the bombs dropped and it's gone off later. Well, here's where it was located. This is a picture I took on the 16th of March 2015 in Carfjord, just at the very spot where it was moored. Bit of snow around, but never mind, it was nice and pleasant. And I went to visit the Tirpitz Museum in Alta, and this was an interesting place to go. It's a private museum founded by this chap, Evan Blomqvist, who, through an interpreter, most unusual for a Norwegian, he didn't speak much English, but he was in his mid-80s, and he recalled the story of him and his brother sitting on top of their house, watching the Lancasters come in. And he decided that it was time a museum was dedicated to the raid. And here's a few exhibits. Here's some pictures of the of some of the crew. And on the shore, there's the band trying to give it to the Norwegians, no doubt. And here's a picture of the crew and one of the turrets. Don't suppose many of those survived. And of course, a lot of things have gone on since. People have dived down and found things. And here's a wallet that had sat on the seabed for 59 years. So you can see here some of the old German currency, 5 Reichsmarks, ID for the person it belonged to, and a bit more artifacts from that wallet. And here's the certificate they must have found in the name of the Führer and the officers of the Wehrmacht. We bestow on you Iron Cross second class. It was the 2nd of October 1943. So it was given to someone before the ship was sunk. and a bit more from it with and the Iron Cross. And the ID for this crew member. Fascinating, really. They were able to pull it up after all those years. And here's a bit of the radio equipment. One of the interesting things that our guide told us, that people that live around there after it was sunk and after the Germans obviously left Norway, most people had crockery, which was had the crest of the Tirpitz on. She said her grandmother had a nice set of dinner plates and all sorts of booty. More of the equipment. This museum's privately owned, so Mr. Blomqvist only gets it from contributions, people that pay to go in, or friends of the museum. So it's through him is that we were able to see all this material. Here we are, telephone. And something else fascinated me was these Johnny Walker diving mines. You associate Johnny Walker with whiskey, don't you? So there are all sorts of mines tried to drop those round the Tirpitz, but not as effective as Barnes Wallis's bombs. And here's the remains of one of the Johnny Walker mines. And here's supposed to be the Royal Navy arming the mines. And here's some of the crockery of the sort that was liberated, no doubt, by the Norwegians, who thought they did deserve it, didn't they? What they had to put up with. And some of the uniforms. I don't know whether these were recovered or whether they were some that perhaps they took from the Germans when they surrendered in May 1945. And a bit more of the communications equipment. The aftermath, well, tactically that was the end of the German Navy's battle fleet, although things like the Scharnhorst and the Prince Eugen did go out to sea, but I think the Scharnhorst was sunk by HMS Belfast. So it brought an end to really the threat of the Kriegsmarine, and salvage operations took until 1957 before Carfjord was clear. But one of the consequences is that a lot of the vegetation will not grow in that area because they use this in the smoke screens, chlorosulfonic acid. Because March isn't the best time to show vegetation, because we're right up in the tundra area now, where the vegetation is fairly limited. But even to this day, the area is not recovered. Hughenden Manor then, let's just go to that. As I said, I promise it's not going to be long. Hughenden Manor in Buckinghamshire. What is it? It's a National Trust property. And it was the home of the Earl of Beaconsfield. Well, who was he? Well, better known as a politician and writer, Benjamin Disraeli. And I say I'd visited there in 1960 with the school, and I think I was doing my GCE O-level in history, where we did Disraeli and Gladstone as part of the syllabus, along with the South African Wars and Irish Home Rule and I've been able to visit places associated with that. But little known, and it wasn't really found out until around 2003, I believe, that the buildings were used for Operation Hillside, which was a secret map making unit. And how this came to be discovered was there was an elderly gentleman with his grandson saying, well, grandson, or whatever his grandson's name was, I'm going to tell you what I did in the war. And one of the guides was earwigging and said, oh, what did you do? And he said, well, I was based here, but I can't tell you about it because I've signed the Official Secrets Act. Well, eventually the National Trust got this chap and got on to whoever it is in the ministry to excuse him from being bound by the Official Secrets Act, and they went round and eventually found loads of other people working there. And this is where they made maps for bombers and for bombing raids. And I saw on the wall one for the Tirpitz. So the maps that the Lancasters used were made at Hughenden Manor. I've got no pictures inside because it was so dark and they wouldn't let you use flash, but here we are. This is now what's on one of these outbuildings, the Air Ministry photographic unit, and here that map was made. Here's our guide taking us in. Looks like an outhouse, really, doesn't it? It's not the Grand Manor. Now, the interesting thing was that this group of people were a mixture of civilians and service people. And there were a lot of artists employed. Well, of course, they're ideal for map making. And keeping discipline must have been quite a problem. But they did make very accurate maps, so you can say that the Tirpitz's fate was tied up with what went on inside that building. And here's just a view of Hughenden Manor. Well, here endeth the lesson. I hope you found that of interest, and you can turn on your mics. If there are any questions, I'll try and answer them. I'm not a historian, so don't throw too many difficult questions to me.
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Robert. That was super.
Excellent.
Really, really interesting little talk.
Yeah, very good, Bob. Thank you.
Excellent stuff.